The sleet was a stinging curtain of gray as Mr. Elvis stepped out of the pressurized silence of his Maybach, his $1,000 shoes clicking against the salt-crusted pavement. He didn't look like a man about to perform an act of charity. He looked like a scientist beginning a cold, calculated experiment. Standing before Chiere, he watched the way she shielded Winnie, her body a frail but fierce barricade against the freezing wind. Without a word, he reached into his breast pocket and withdrew a matte black titanium card, a key to a kingdom she couldn't even imagine. 24 hours, he said, his voice cutting through the roar of the city traffic like a blade. No limits, no questions. Spend what you want, and we'll see if you're exactly what the world says you are. He pressed the card into her trembling, chapped hand and turned away before she could even find the breath to thank him. He didn't want gratitude. He wanted proof that his father's cynical gospel was the only truth left in the world. Back in the leather-scented sanctuary of his car, Elvis pulled out his phone, his thumb hovering over the banking app. He expected the first notification to be a frantic dash for luxury, a high-end hotel, a designer wardrobe, perhaps a flight to a warmer climate. But 30 minutes later, the phone chirped with a notification that made his breath hitch. It wasn't for food. It wasn't for a bed, and it wasn't for gold. The receipt was for $32 at a 24-hour pharmacy 3 blocks away. He stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in his narrowed eyes. A billionaire's fortune was at her fingertips, and she had started with a bottle of children's fever reducer and a pair of wool socks. It was a purchase so small, yet so profoundly selfless, that the first hairline crack appeared in the ice surrounding his heart. He had handed her a blank check to rewrite her life, and she was busy trying to save a child's night. The experiment had begun, but as he watched the digital breadcrumbs of her survival, Elvis realized he might not be the one in control of the results. To the world outside the tinted windows of the Maybach, Elvis was a man who had conquered the very concept of gravity. At 42, he stood at the helm of a sprawling logistics and tech empire valued at $11 billion, a kingdom built on the efficiency of movement and the elimination of human error. His office sat 60 floors above the city, a glass and steel fortress where the air was always filtered and the noise of the struggling masses was reduced to a silent, distant hum. He moved through his life with the surgical precision of the algorithms his company sold, his movements choreographed by a team of assistants who anticipated his needs before he even felt them. But inside the silence of his penthouse, surrounded by original Picassos and a wine cellar that held the history of Europe, Elvis was a man who lived in a permanent winter. He was the sole heir to a legacy of suspicion. His father, a titan of the old guard named Silas, had raised him not with bedtime stories, but with cautionary tales. Silas had viewed the world as a battlefield where every handshake was a potential ambush. A man's net worth is the only honest thing about him, Elvis, his father would growl, his voice like grinding stones. The moment you look at a person and see a soul instead of a balance sheet, you've already lost, especially the ones at the bottom. They don't want to hand up. They want to drag you down into the mud so they don't have to look up at you. This was the gospel Elvis had memorized before he knew his multiplication tables. He had learned to read the tells of desperation, the way a shark reads a drop of blood in the water. To him, every plea for help was a scripted performance, every tear a calculated tool for leverage. He had watched his father dismantle competitors and ignore the pleas of striking workers with a terrifying, icy calm, and Elvis had inherited that frost. It was a protective armor that made him invincible in the boardroom, but it had turned his personal life into a series of hollow transactions. He had been married once, a brief, sterile union to a woman of equal standing, but it had withered when she realized that Elvis looked at her not with love, but with the same analytical scrutiny he applied to a quarterly earnings report. He woke every morning at 4:30 a.m., his mind immediately racing with global markets and shipping delays. But as he stood on his balcony overlooking the city, he often felt a strange, inexplicable sensation of vertigo, not from the height, but from the depth of his own isolation. He was an $11 billion island.
He had everything money could buy, yet he found himself obsessively checking the security feeds of his own home, searching for a threat that didn't exist, or perhaps searching for a sign of life that did. On this particular evening, the rain was beginning to turn into a sleet that coated the city in a treacherous gray glaze. Elvis adjusted his silk tie, the fiber cool against his skin, and prepared to descend from his tower. He was headed to a gala where he would be expected to smile for cameras and sign a giant check for a cause he didn't believe in, all to maintain the optics of his brand. His father's voice echoed in his head as he pulled on his cashmere overcoat. "Remember, Elvis, the world is divided into predators and prey. If you're not holding the leash, you're the one being walked." He had no idea that in less than an hour, the leash of his own cynicism would be snapped by a woman who owned nothing but an old teddy bear and a heart that hadn't yet been frozen by the world. He was the prince of industry, a master of the universe, but as he stepped into the elevator, he was merely a man about to encounter a force that no algorithm could predict and no amount of gold could defend against. He was prepared for a fight, prepared for a deal, and prepared for a betrayal. He was not, however, prepared to be broken. The sleek black Maybach glided through the slush of the city like a predatory shark, its cabin a vacuum of leather-scented silence. Inside, Elvis watched the rain-streaked world through glass that was reinforced and heavily tinted, a physical barrier between his $11 billion reality and the chaos of the streets. He was checking a live feed of the Tokyo markets on a tablet when a sudden protest or stalled vehicle forced his driver to take an unplanned detour. The car slowed, diverted away from the grand avenues and into the shadowed concrete veins of the city's underbelly, eventually coming to a halt near the entrance of a crumbling subway station. "Mechanical issue with the car ahead, sir," the driver whispered, his voice tinged with apology. "It will be just a moment." Elvis sighed, a sound of pure impatience, and looked out the window. The station entrance was a gaping mouth of damp concrete, exhaling the metallic, cold breath of the underground. And there, huddled against the salt-stained tiles to escape the freezing sleet, was a sight that should have been invisible to a man like him. Chiere sat on a flattened cardboard box, her back against the freezing wall. She was wrapped in a coat that had seen too many winters, its edges frayed and its stuffing thin. Her face was a landscape of bone-deep exhaustion. Her eyes were sunken, framed by the dark shadows of 1,000 sleepless nights. She wasn't begging, she wasn't holding a sign or calling out to the few commuters hurrying past. She was simply existing in a state of quiet, desperate endurance. In her arms, she held a small girl, no more than 5 or 6 years old. Winnie was a stark contrast to the grime of the station. Despite their circumstances, the child was tucked into the mother's chest with a fierce, protective urgency. Winnie was fast asleep, her breathing heavy with the onset of a cold, her small hand white-knuckled as it clutched a worn, earless teddy bear. To Chiere, the child was clearly the only thing in the world that mattered. To the world, they were just another piece of urban scenery to be stepped over. Elvis felt a flicker of the old cynicism rise in his throat. He thought of his father's voice. "Look at the positioning, Elvis. The child is the prop. It's a stage play designed to loosen the wallets of the weak." But as he watched, something happened that didn't fit the script. A commuter accidentally dropped a heavy bag near them, the loud crack echoing like a gunshot. Chiere didn't reach out for money or use the moment to wail. Instead, she instantly hunched over Winnie, shielding the girl's ears and pressing her own forehead against the child's hair, whispering silent comforts, while her own body shivered violently from the cold. The contrast was staggering. Elvis looked down at his own hands, manicured, warm, resting on a cashmere coat that cost more than a year of rent for a 3-bedroom apartment. Then he looked at the digital display in the car showing his net worth fluctuating by thousands of dollars every second. Then he looked back at the woman whose entire world was currently resting on a piece of discarded cardboard. For the first time in his life, the gospel of distrust felt like a heavy, suffocating weight. He saw the stress lines etched into Chiere's forehead, the way her grip on her daughter never loosened even as her own eyes fluttered shut from fatigue. She looked like a soldier who had been on the front lines for too long, fighting a war against hunger and cold that she was destined to lose. The driver shifted the car into gear as the path cleared, but Elvis didn't look back at his tablet. He found himself staring at the reflection of the station in the rearview mirror until it disappeared into the gray fog of the rain. His father had taught him that the poor were dangerous because they wanted what he had. But as he watched Chiere, he realized with a jolt of discomfort that she didn't want his empire or his Picassos. She wanted a dry floor. She wanted a coat for her daughter. She wanted a moment where she didn't have to be afraid. The silence of the Maybach felt deafening. The prince of industry, the man who could move mountains of capital with a thumbprint, felt a strange cold crack forming in the ice around his heart. He realized he was heading to a ballroom to talk about impact, while the real impact of the world was shivering under a subway sign. He didn't know it yet, but the detour had been more than a change in route. It was the beginning of the end of the man he had been taught to be. He reached for the door handle, his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm he didn't recognize. He was about to do the one thing his father had forbidden. He was about to stop being a predator and start being a human. The impulse to stop wasn't born of mercy, but of a cold intellectual curiosity that felt more like a scientific experiment than an act of grace. Elvis signaled his driver to pull over, the heavy door of the Maybach clicking open with a sound of absolute authority. As he stepped onto the salt-stained pavement, the freezing sleet immediately began to ruin his cashmere coat, but he didn't care. He walked toward the subway entrance, his handmade leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the concrete until he stood directly over the woman and the sleeping child. Chiere looked up, her eyes wide with a sudden sharp fear. She didn't see a savior, she saw a predator in a tailored suit. She pulled Winnie closer, her knuckles turning white as she braced for the inevitable, the order to move along, the sharp words of a man who owned the sidewalk she was resting on. But Elvis didn't speak first. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small, rectangular piece of titanium, a sleek, matte black credit card with no limit and no restrictions.
"You have 24 hours, Elvis said, his voice flat and devoid of warmth. The wind whipped between them, carrying the scent of expensive cologne and damp wool. He held the card out between two fingers, a tiny bridge spanning the impossible distance between their lives. No conditions, no questions. Spend whatever you want on whatever you need. If you want to book a flight to the other side of the world, do it. If you want to buy out a jewelry store, the card will clear. I want to see exactly what a person in your position does when the walls are taken down." Chiere stared at the card as if it were a live coal. Her breath hitched in her throat, a small puff of white vapor in the freezing air. "Why?" she whispered, her voice raspy from the cold and weeks of silence. Elvis leaned in slightly, the shadow of his father's cynical smile playing on his lips. "Because I want to know if my father was right," he replied. "He believed that desperation makes thieves of everyone. He believed that if I gave you this, you would vanish into the night and spend every cent on yourself, forgetting everyone else. Prove him right or prove him wrong. It makes no difference to me." He dropped the card into her lap. It landed softly on the thin, wet fabric of her coat, looking like a piece of alien technology against the grime of the subway station. Chiere looked at the card, then at the sleeping face of Winnie, and finally up at the man who looked like he was made of ice. She didn't say thank you. The weight of the moment was too heavy for gratitude. It was a burden, a test, a terrifying opportunity. Elvis didn't wait for her to find her voice. He turned on his heel and walked back to the idling car, the sleet melting into the dark fabric of his shoulders. He didn't look back. As the door sealed him back into his world of filtered air and silent luxury, he pulled out his phone and opened his banking app. The account was flagged to send him a push notification for every single cent spent. "Drive," he commanded. As the Maybach pulled away, Elvis felt a strange electric tension in his chest. He was a man who had gambled millions on the stock market without a flinch, but this felt different. This was a bet on the human soul. He expected to see a transaction for a luxury hotel within 20 minutes. He expected a massive cash withdrawal at an ATM. He settled back into the leather seat, his eyes fixed on the dark screen of his phone, waiting for the first sign of the greed he had been taught was inevitable. He was ready to watch her fail. He was ready to be right.
He had no idea that the first notification, when it finally arrived, would be the beginning of the end of everything he believed to be true.
But as the hours passed, the phone revealed a story that was increasingly difficult to categorize as theft. There was a charge for a modest motel, not the Four Seasons he had predicted, but a clean, quiet place on the edge of the district. Then a final late-night transaction that made him pause. It was a $100 withdrawal, the maximum allowed for a single cash advance on that specific security tier. He gripped the phone tighter. There it is, he thought, the hidden pocket, the untraceable cash, the first crack in the facade. Yet, as he looked at the map of the transactions, he realized she hadn't left the neighborhood. She was still within the radius of the struggle. He looked at his own reflection in the glass, a man surrounded by billions, yet so starved for truth that he was obsessing over the price of a bottle of ibuprofen. He had given her the keys to his kingdom, expecting her to burn it down for the insurance money. Instead, she seemed to be using his fire just to keep a child warm. The ice around his heart didn't melt, but it began to groan under the pressure of a new, uncomfortable reality. For 30 years, his father had told him that the poor were a bottomless pit of need. But as Elvis watched the digital breadcrumbs of Chieri's night, he began to see something else. A woman who was taking exactly what was needed to survive, and not a penny for the vanity he had assumed was universal. He closed his eyes. The blue light of the phone still burned into his retinas, wondering if the person who had actually failed the test wasn't the woman in the subway, but the man in the penthouse. The sun rose over the city not as a golden herald, but as a pale, indifferent light filtering through the lingering sleet. Elvis was waiting at the mouth of the subway station long before the morning commute began. He stood by a rusted pillar, his hands buried deep in his pockets, feeling the unaccustomed weight of his own heartbeat. His phone was silent now, the stream of notifications having ended with that final, mysterious cash withdrawal. He expected to find Chieri gone. Perhaps she had taken the girl and fled to a different part of the state, or perhaps she was hiding, fearing the moment the magic card would be deactivated. Instead, he found her exactly where he had left her, though the transformation was jarring. She was sitting on the same cardboard box, but she was wrapped in a new, thick charcoal gray coat. Winnie was still asleep, but she was tucked inside a high-quality thermal sleeping bag, her breath hitching less than it had the night before. Chieri looked up as his shadow fell over her, and for the first time, the paralyzing fear in her eyes had been replaced by a weary, profound dignity. Without a word, she reached into her pocket and held out the matte black titanium card. He took it, the metal cold against his palm, but his eyes were fixed on the small stack of crumpled thermal paper she held in her other hand. "The receipts," she whispered, her voice a low tremor. "I kept every one. I wanted you to see." He took the slips of paper, his fingers brushing against hers, a brief contact that felt like an electric shock to his guarded system. He scanned the items he had already tracked digitally, the medicine, the warm socks, the motel room where they had clearly showered and rested for a few hours before returning to wait for him. But his eyes stopped at the final receipt, the one corresponding to the $100 cash withdrawal. It wasn't a receipt from a store. It was a handwritten note on a scrap of lined paper tucked behind the official slips. It was a simple acknowledgement from a woman named Maria, another mother Elvis had noticed huddled in the far corner of the station the night before. The note thanked Chieri for the $50 that had allowed Maria to buy a bus ticket to her sister's house in the next state. The other 50, Chieri explained quietly, had gone to the elderly man who swept the stair steps, whose boots had fallen apart in the slush. Elvis felt the air leave his lungs. He looked at the receipts, then at the woman who was still technically homeless, still shivering, and yet had spent the final portion of a billionaire's fortune on people who were slightly more desperate than herself. "You didn't buy jewelry," he said, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. "You didn't even buy a car or a permanent place to stay. You had an unlimited card, Chieri. You could have changed your entire life in 24 hours. Chieri stood up slowly, adjusting Winnie in her arms. She looked him directly in the eyes, stripping away the $11 billion barrier between them. "I did change my life," she said firmly. "For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't a predator or a victim. I was someone who could help.
Mr. Elvis, you gave me more than money. You gave me back the ability to be kind. That is the only thing the street couldn't take from me, and the only thing I was terrified of losing." The gospel of distrust that had governed Elvis's life didn't just crack, it shattered. He looked at the thermal paper in his hand, the truth he had been searching for, and realized it wasn't a record of greed, but a map of a soul he wasn't worthy of. His father had been wrong. Desperation didn't make thieves of everyone. For some, it made them saints. He looked at the small, earless teddy bear Winnie was still clutching, and then at Chieri's tired, triumphant face. The billionaire, the prince of industry, felt a hot, stinging moisture in his eyes that he hadn't felt since he was a child. He realized then that he hadn't been testing her at all. The universe had been testing him, and it was Chieri who had provided the passing grade. He reached out, not to take anything back, but to finally, for the first time in his life, offer a hand that didn't have a price tag attached to it.
The silence that followed Chieri's words was more profound than any peace Elvis had ever found in his soundproofed boardroom. He looked at the woman standing before him, small, exhausted, yet possessing a moral gravity that made his billions feel like nothing more than heavy, useless stones. The wind continued to howl through the subway entrance, but the cold no longer seemed to touch him. The ice that had armored his heart for 3 decades hadn't just cracked, it had dissolved, leaving behind a raw, aching vulnerability he hadn't felt since he was a young boy watching his father's shadow darken the doorway. "You're not staying here," Elvis said, his voice no longer the flat monotone of a CEO, but thick with an unfamiliar emotion. He reached out, his hand hovering for a second, before he gently touched Chieri's shoulder. Not another hour, not another minute. He didn't wait for her to protest. He signaled the Maybach, which had been idling like a silent sentinel a block away. As the car pulled up, the driver, a man who had seen Elvis dismiss 1,000-man workforces without a blink, stared in shock as his employer personally opened the heavy rear door for a woman in a frayed coat and a child clutching a one-eared bear. The transition from the grime of the station to the interior of the car was instantaneous. Chieri sank into the heated leather seats, her body trembling not from the cold, but from the sudden, overwhelming release of a survival instinct she had been forced to maintain for too long. "To the Four Seasons," Elvis commanded, "the presidential suite." During the short drive, Elvis watched Winnie. The girl had woken up, her large, dark eyes blinking in wonder at the soft, ambient lighting and the polished wood grain of the car's interior. She didn't ask for food or toys. She simply reached out and touched the soft leather of the seat as if making sure it was real. Elvis felt a lump form in his throat. For years, he had used his wealth as a shield to keep the world away, a wall to ensure that no one could ever get close enough to hurt him. Now, for the first time, he was using it as a bridge. When they arrived at the hotel, the staff moved with a practiced, hushed efficiency, though their eyes betrayed their curiosity at the billionaire's bedraggled guests. Elvis ignored them all. He led Chieri and Winnie into a suite that spanned half a floor, a place of plush carpets, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor, and air that smelled of jasmine and expensive linen. Chieri stood in the center of the vast living room, looking as though she were afraid to move, afraid that a single step might shatter the dream. Winnie, however, saw the massive cloud-like bed in the adjoining room. She looked at Elvis, then at her mother, and when Chieri gave a small, tearful nod, the girl ran to it, climbing onto the silk duvet and burying her face in a pile of down pillows. "There's a bath," Elvis said softly, pointing toward the marble bathroom where steam was already beginning to rise from a deep soaking tub. "There's food coming. Anything you want. Stay as long as you need." He walked over to the window, looking out at the city he thought he owned. He realized then that he had spent his entire life accumulating numbers, chasing a high score in a game that had no meaning. He had thought money was for power, for influence, for the ability to bend the world to his will. He had been a king of a hollow mountain. Looking at Chieri, who was now weeping silently as she realized her daughter was finally safe, Elvis understood the truth that his father had tried so hard to bury. Money wasn't a scorecard. It wasn't a weapon. It was a tool of restoration. For the first time in his life, the expensive emptiness of his existence was being filled.
He felt a sense of purpose that made his corporate victories look like child's play. He wasn't just a prince of industry anymore. He was a man who had seen a life in the dark and decided to turn on the light. As he watched the steam from the bath curl into the air, Elvis felt the last of his father's ghost leave the room. He finally knew what his billions were for. They were for this. They were for making sure that a mother's kindness didn't result in her destruction and that a child's innocence wasn't sacrificed to the cold. He stood there in the silent suite, a billionaire broken open by the grace of a stranger, finally learning how to be rich. In the days that followed, Elvis did not return to the sterile quiet of his penthouse. The boardroom meetings and global market fluctuations that had once been the pulse of his existence now felt like echoes from a previous life, distant and remarkably hollow. He spent his mornings in the hotel suite, sitting at a small table with his laptop, but he wasn't looking at shipping manifests or pharmaceutical patents. He was looking at a business plan for 2 human lives. He approached the task with the same obsessive precision he used to build his empire, but this time the metrics of success were not profit margins, but stability, safety, and a future. He started with the foundation, a home. He didn't want them in a hotel forever, but he also knew that a luxury penthouse would be another kind of cage for Chiere. He found a bright 3-bedroom apartment in a quiet, tree-laned neighborhood, a place with large windows that let in the morning sun and a kitchen that smelled of possibilities rather than desperation. He didn't just pay the deposit, he bought the entire unit through a trust, ensuring that as long as Chiere lived, she would never have to look at a landlord or fear an eviction notice again. Then came Winnie's turn. Elvis spent hours researching schools, eventually selecting a private academy known for its nurturing environment and focus on the arts. He imagined the girl who had spent years clutching a one-eared bear in the dark, finally standing in a sunlit classroom with a paintbrush in her hand. He set up a scholarship fund in her name that would cover not just her primary education, but her university tuition and beyond. He was building a wall of security around her, one that no economic downturn or stroke of bad luck could ever breach. But the most delicate part of the investment was Chiere herself. Elvis knew that a monthly check would be a form of charity that might eventually feel like a burden to a woman of her spirit. He had seen her dignity in the subway. She didn't want to be a dependent, she wanted to be a participant in the world. He discovered that before the spiral of medical bills and job losses that took her home, Chiere had been a gifted administrator with a passion for community health. He didn't just offer her a job, he created a role within his corporate social responsibility wing that focused on urban outreach. "I'm not giving you a salary for nothing," he told her on an afternoon. "I'm hiring you because you understand a side of this city that my directors are blind to. You've lived the gaps in the system. I want you to help me close them." Chiere looked at the documents, the deed to the apartment, the school enrollment forms, and the employment contract, and she began to weep. But they were no longer the ragged tears of the subway. These were the tears of a person being stitched back together. She looked at Elvis, seeing not the prince of industry, but a man who was finally using his power to heal. Elvis watched her, and for the first time, he understood what real wealth felt like. It wasn't the number of zeros in his bank account, it was the weight of the keys he was placing in Chiere's hand. He was investing in a human being, and the return was the sight of Winnie running through the suite in a new pair of shoes that didn't pinch her feet. He realized that for 37 years he had been a hoarder of resources, but in 1 week he had become a gardener of souls. He was finally learning that the only way to truly keep his fortune was to give it away to the people who knew the true value of a single humble dollar. The transition from the hotel suite to the new apartment didn't involve a fleet of professional movers or a white-glove delivery service. Instead, in a move that would have left his board of directors speechless, Elvis decided to handle the move-in himself. He traded his charcoal bespoke suit for a pair of denim jeans and a simple cotton shirt, feeling a strange, tactile thrill in the mundane. He found himself standing in the center of a maze of flat-packed boxes in the new living room, an Allen wrench in his hand and a complicated instruction manual spread out on the hardwood floor. For a man who could navigate the complexities of international trade laws, the assembly of a simple bookshelf proved to be a humbling ordeal. He knelt on the floor, his brow furrowed in concentration, trying to distinguish between a hex bolt and a cam lock. Chiere watched him from the kitchen, a soft, genuine smile playing on her lips, the first one Elvis had seen that didn't have a shadow of worry behind it. Winnie was already busy, helping by handing him wooden dowels and naming each one after a different animal. "I think part C is supposed to go into slot J," Chiere suggested, leaning against the doorframe. Elvis looked at the diagram, then at the half-finished structure that looked more like a modern art sculpture than furniture. He let out a short, dry bark of a laugh. It wasn't the polite, measured chuckle he used at charity galas. It was a real sound, rusty from disuse. "I've overseen the construction of a 60-story skyscraper in Dubai," he admitted, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "But this piece of Swedish particle board might be the thing that finally breaks me." As the afternoon light mellowed into a warm amber, the apartment began to transform. The bookshelves stood upright, mostly straight, and were quickly filled with a collection of children's books Elvis had hand-selected. The scent of new fabric and fresh paint filled the air, a clean, hopeful aroma that signaled the death of the subway smell that had haunted them. Elvis found himself sitting on the floor surrounded by packing peanuts, helping Winnie build a castle out of the empty boxes. In that moment, the distance between the billionaire and the mother vanished entirely. There were no balance sheets, no legacies of distrust, no ghosts of his father whispering about the dangers of the poor. There was only the sound of Winnie's high-pitched giggles as Elvis intentionally let his cardboard tower collapse. He realized that for his entire adult life, he had been chasing the sound of applause, the roar of the crowd at a successful IPO, the clink of crystal at a victory dinner. But that applause was a lonely sound. It was an acknowledgement of status, not a connection of spirits. The laughter ringing through this modest apartment was different. It was an investment that didn't require a contract. It was the sound of a child who was no longer afraid of the dark, and a mother who finally believed in tomorrow. Elvis looked at his hands, which were dusty and slightly bruised from the work, and felt a sense of accomplishment that far outweighed any merger he had ever closed. He had spent billions trying to build a world that couldn't touch him, only to find that the only world worth living in was one where he was willing to get his hands dirty. As they shared a simple dinner of pizza, delivered to the new address, eaten on paper plates on the floor because the dining table was still in pieces, Elvis felt a profound, quiet joy. He wasn't just an architect of industry anymore. He was an architect of home. He had traded the cold, sterile perfection of his penthouse for the beautiful, messy reality of a family's new beginning. And as he watched Winnie fall asleep against Chiere's shoulder right there on the new rug, he knew he had finally found the one thing his father never could, a place where he truly belonged.
2 years had passed since the night the rain turned to sleet and a titanium card changed the trajectory of 3 lives. Elvis stood backstage at the city's historic town hall, adjusting a tie that felt less like a noose and more like a uniform for a new kind of service. He wasn't there to announce a hostile takeover or a record-breaking profit margin. He was there to launch the Ashford Reeves Foundation, an initiative dedicated to family stability and first-step interventions for those lost in the city's cracks. As he looked through the curtain, he saw Chiere sitting in the front row. She was no longer the ghost-like figure from the subway station. She looked radiant in a professional blazer, her eyes bright with the confidence of a woman who led the foundation's outreach programs. Beside her sat Winnie, now 8 years old, swinging her legs and whispering to the same earless teddy bear, which had been meticulously cleaned and repaired. Elvis stepped onto the stage, and for the first time in his life, the applause didn't feel like a hollow ritual. He didn't lead with data or economic forecasts. Instead, he told the story of a mother who had nothing and still found a way to give to others. He spoke about how the gospel of distrust had nearly cost him his humanity, and how a $30 receipt for children's medicine had been more valuable than his entire stock portfolio. "For most of my life, I believed that wealth was about accumulation," Elvis told the hushed crowd. "I believed that to be powerful was to be untouchable, but I was wrong. True wealth is the ability to look at a stranger and say, 'I see you.' True power is the courage to be broken open by someone else's struggle. My father taught me that the poor were a threat to my fortune, but Chiere taught me that they were the keepers of my purpose. As he spoke, he felt the final remnants of his father's cold legacy evaporate into the warm light of the auditorium. He realized that the 24-hour experiment he had started in the rain hadn't been a test for Chiere at all. It had been a test for himself, a test to see if he was capable of recognizing grace when it was staring him in the face. He had spent billions trying to find a reason to trust the world, only to find it in the quiet dignity of a woman who refused to let poverty steal her heart. The foundation was his way of multiplying that meaning, of ensuring that no other mother had to choose between warmth and medicine. As he finished his speech, Winnie broke away from her seat and ran up the steps, throwing her arms around his waist. Elvis knelt, hugging the child who had once slept on a cold subway floor and felt a peace that no boardroom victory could ever provide. He had finally passed the test. He wasn't just a billionaire anymore. He was a man who had traded his ice for an inheritance of hope. As he walked off the stage with Winnie's hand in his, Elvis realized that he was finally, truly, the richest man in the world.
Hi, D. Lawson. We love you. Hey, family. Thank you for the constant love and support on this channel. Every like, share, comment, and subscription truly means everything to me and helps this community keep growing. If you're enjoying these stories, please like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Also, drop your name and where you're watching from in the comments. I'll be giving personal shoutouts and thanking you directly in my next post. Fingers crossed. I appreciate every single one of you.